At the strategic level, echoing very much the point that Ambassador Lute made, the war in Afghanistan ought not have been a war to begin with. Despite the imperative to go against Al-Qaeda in the legitimacy of its causa belli, the massively asymmetric war against the Taliban could have been fought in one with little to no US boots on the ground. What Afghanistan needed at the outset of 2001 intervention was a political strategy, one that would include fully Afghanizing the war, building up the Afghan state, and pursuing a regional approach to defeating terrorism and the Taliban insurgency. The manner in which the intervention unfolded, however, got this formula in reverse order, giving primacy to fighting the war, making political strategy subservient to the military effort. Rather than an end in itself, Afghan state building became an auxiliary project in the service of the American-led intervention. Here are a few examples of how this unfolded. Firstly, the war effort. Most non-Taliban Afghans in 2001 were fully aligned with the US intervention and eager to do its bidding. With some training, equipping, and supervision from the US, we would easily have fully owned the war and won it too. But rather than Afghanizing the war at the outset, the US decided to fight it on its own terms and largely by its own means. An obvious outcome of the strategy was an ill-conceived, poorly informed, overly militarized, and unnecessarily heavy-handed approach to a low-intensity fight against the enemy that was little more than a ramshackle insurgency at the time. From night raids to drone strikes to bunker buster bombs, the application of overwhelming force alienated the population. And this continued later in the surge period at an even higher level. And as we know now, the Taliban only thrived on these grievances in the sense of alienation that this generated. By 2009, when President Obama announced the course correction, the contours of the unwinnable war were already in place, and little was done qualitatively differently to change the status quo ante. Despite the stated goal of the surge, the hugely unhelpful timelines, the US actually never transitioned the ownership or execution of the war to Afghans. In the actual conduct of the war, Afghans remained onlookers or secondary players at best, from the shadowy militias run by the US government to the various specialized units, or even the ANA. Afghan role in the war basically boiled down to an accessory or a hired gun. I'll come to the governance issue. Unlike the military effort, which was never transitioned, certain governance functions were transitioned almost too quickly to underprepared Afghan hands and as a result failed. The organization of national elections, for example, was a task which might have benefited from continued international stewardship, preferably through the United Nations. Despite our consultative culture and some limited experience in an electoral democracy from the 1960s, elections in the entire democratization gambit were a novelty for Afghanistan of 2001. Our elections therefore became progressively worse, culminating in the fiasco that we saw in 2019. In many areas where Afghans should have been given more space to exercise greater control, Afghan ownership remained more than a mantra or an unfulfilled promise. In the aid sector, for instance, foreigners exercised stringent control, and the military contracting world remained entirely outside the purview of the Afghan government. This left the Afghan government looking irrelevant and reinforcing a growing environment of acceptance for widespread corruption. The surge, especially in its political and economic fronts, further deepened the delta between the US and the Afghan government, as the latter came to be seen increasingly as a liability rather than a partner. The perennial gap of mutual expectations between the US and Afghans led to a fundamental fragmentation at the heart of the partnership. There were always two spheres of activity. The foreigners had their own summits, their own strategic discussions, made their own decisions and the resources for their own mission. Afghans, on the other hand, occupied the domestic political sphere. And under an overarching rubric of inclusion and democracy, this gradually succumbed to pressures of corruption, nepotism, and kleptocracy. where there were clashes between the two spheres, like it happened in the case of local governance issues and the role of provincial governments. Invariably, the Afghan government ended up losing and feeling weak in the face of well-resourced parallel structures that were, such as the PRTs, that were adopted by the international actors. There were even deeper levels of fragmentation on the US government side, and I'm not going to go into details about the various government entities that were pursuing conflicting agendas. The coordination between them was poor, and particularly their messages to Afghan counterparts were inconsistent. One leader might have been treated as a partner by the military, a suspect by the intelligence, or a liability by the diplomats. This inconsistently not only confused Afghan leaders, but also led to conflicting policies and efforts. The final point observation is on the regional front in Pakistan. The Afghan war was primarily a product of its regional context, and the US knew this all along. However, the US war-led effort never produced a coherent strategy on this front. For too long, the US either underestimated or willfully ignored Pakistan's role in feeding war and instability in Afghanistan. And when I say this, I speak from experience and remember all the intensity of discussions on trying to convince our American partners about the role that Pakistan was playing. Everyone knew that the war could not be won as long as Pakistani sanctuaries remained untouched, yet the focus remained rigidly on the Afghan soil. This failure was perhaps the most consequential mistake of the entire war. The broader region, on the other hand, despite its complexities, initially presented the US with an opportunity. This could have been taken and should have been taken to define a new beginning, including the regional powers, Russia, China, and Iran, whose hitherto zero-sum relations with the US went far beyond Afghanistan. A fresh opportunity arose under President Obama as regional countries realized that the US presence was time-bound. This realization could have been nurtured into a consensus for the future of Afghanistan through diplomacy, without the future of Afghanistan without the US presence through diplomatic effort. As a diplomat myself at the time, I saw such consensus as not only possible, but also vital for the future of Afghanistan. Instead, the US continued to pursue largely bilateral dealings without coherent regional strategy, often exacerbating tensions rather than mediating them. Honorable members, in focusing on the US in my remarks, I'm by no means seeking to diminish the agency of the Afghans. There's a terribly heavy burden of responsibility that we bear for squandering a historic opportunity for our country, and I personally feel that. Afghans, I must say, remain hopeful despite everything for a better future. Many still believe that the values the United States is known to uphold and represent are important to today's world. It would be a mistake for the US to take past lessons as a recipe for recoiling from action and engagement. Instead, lessons are there to ensure that future interventions are wiser and better informed by understanding and humility. Thank you.